Last night, my ex-husband Marcus showed up at my apartment at 11 p.m., sobbing and asking if we could try again because his wife Stephanie had left him for his younger brother Tyler. He stood on my doorstep holding a bouquet of wilted flowers from a gas station, telling me that losing Stephanie made him realize I was the love of his life and that he'd made the biggest mistake of his life when he divorced me 5 years ago. I'm still processing the fact that the man who told me I was boring and that we'd grown apart now wants me back because the woman he left me for decided his brother was more exciting. I'm 36F and Marcus is 38M. We were married for 8 years before our divorce was finalized 5 years ago. We met in college and got married when I was 23, and for the first few years everything seemed great. We bought a house together, both had stable careers, and talked about starting a family eventually. But around year 6 of our marriage, Marcus started becoming restless and critical of our relationship. He'd make comments about how we'd fallen into a routine and how he felt like we were more like roommates than a married couple. He started working late more often and would come home complaining that his life felt predictable and boring. I tried to address Marcus's concerns by suggesting we take trips together, try new hobbies, or go to couples counseling. But Marcus seemed resistant to working on our marriage and would say that problems couldn't be solved by forcing activities or talking to strangers about our personal business. Around that time, Marcus started going out more frequently with coworkers for happy hours and weekend events. He'd come home talking about how much fun he'd had and how refreshing it was to be around people who were spontaneous and adventurous. I began to feel like Marcus was comparing me unfavorably to these new friends and finding me lacking in excitement and spontaneity. When I tried to join him for some of these work events, Marcus would seem annoyed and say that I didn't really fit in with his work crowd. About 2 years before our divorce, Marcus started mentioning a new coworker named Stephanie who had joined his marketing team. He'd talk about how creative and energetic she was and how she brought fresh ideas to their projects. According to Marcus, Stephanie was always organizing fun team activities and had this magnetic personality that made everyone want to be around her. Initially, I was happy that Marcus had found a coworker he enjoyed working with. But as he continued talking about Stephanie almost daily, I started feeling uncomfortable with how much he seemed to admire her. When I mentioned that he talked about Stephanie a lot, Marcus got defensive and said I was being paranoid. He said Stephanie was just a colleague and that it was normal to appreciate working with talented people. But Marcus's behavior continued to change in ways that concerned me. He started staying late at work more frequently, claiming he was collaborating with Stephanie on important projects. He'd come home energized in a way I hadn't seen in months, talking excitedly about the creative work he was doing. Marcus also started paying more attention to his appearance. He bought new clothes, started going to the gym regularly, and seemed to care more about how he looked when he left for work each morning. When I asked Marcus if everything was okay in our marriage, he said he was fine, but that he felt like our relationship had become stagnant. He said he missed feeling excited about life and that he wanted to feel passionate about things again. I suggested that we could work together to bring more excitement into our relationship, but Marcus said he wasn't sure that was possible. He said sometimes people just grow in different directions and that maybe we needed to accept that we weren't the same people we'd been when we got married. About 18 months before our divorce, Marcus started working weekends regularly. He said his team was under pressure to complete major projects and that Stephanie had volunteered to work extra hours, so he felt obligated to match her dedication. Marcus would leave Saturday morning and not come home until late Sunday evening, claiming he'd been at the office collaborating with his team. When I suggested visiting him at work or bringing him lunch, Marcus said the office was too chaotic and that I'd be a distraction. Around this time, Marcus became increasingly critical of our marriage and our lifestyle. He'd make comments about how we never did anything spontaneous anymore and how he felt trapped by our suburban routine. He started talking about coworkers who traveled frequently and had exciting social lives, and he'd wonder aloud why our life felt so predictable. Marcus also became less interested in physical intimacy and would often claim he was too tired from work or too stressed about projects to focus on our relationship. When I tried to plan romantic evenings or surprise him with things I thought he'd enjoy, Marcus seemed distracted and unappreciative. 1 year before our divorce, Marcus announced that he thought we should take a break from our marriage to figure out what we really wanted. He said he loved me but wasn't sure he was in love with me anymore and that he needed space to evaluate his feelings. I was devastated by this request, but Marcus said it wasn't necessarily permanent. He claimed he just needed time to think about our relationship without the pressure of daily obligations and expectations. Marcus moved into a furnished apartment across town and said he wanted to use the separation to focus on himself and his career. He assured me that this wasn't about anyone else and that he just needed to rediscover who he was outside of our marriage. But even during our separation, Marcus continued working closely with Stephanie and would mention her frequently when we talked. He'd tell me about projects they were working on together and how much he was learning from collaborating with her. About 6 months into our separation, I found out through a mutual friend that Marcus and Stephanie had been seen together at restaurants and events around town. When I confronted Marcus about this, he initially denied that they were dating and said they were just friends who sometimes grabbed dinner after work. But eventually Marcus admitted that he and Stephanie had developed feelings for each other during our separation. He said he hadn't planned for it to happen, but that their working relationship had naturally evolved into something more personal. Marcus said that his connection with Stephanie had made him realize that our marriage was really over and that we'd been holding on to something that had already died. He said Stephanie made him feel excited about life in a way he hadn't experienced in years. When I asked Marcus if he wanted to try working on our marriage instead of pursuing a relationship with someone else, he said he couldn't ignore his feelings for Stephanie and that it wouldn't be fair to either of us to pretend our marriage could be fixed. Marcus filed for divorce shortly after that conversation. The process was relatively straightforward since we didn't have children and were able to divide our assets without major conflict. Marcus got the house, and I moved into an apartment closer to my job. The divorce was finalized 5 years ago, and Marcus married Stephanie about 2 years later. I heard about their wedding through mutual friends and saw photos on social media showing a lavish ceremony with elaborate decorations and an expensive reception. From what I could see on social media, Marcus and Stephanie seemed to have the exciting, spontaneous lifestyle that Marcus had been craving. They traveled frequently, attended social events constantly, and posted photos from restaurants, concerts, and weekend getaways. Marcus appeared to be living the life he'd wanted, married to someone who shared his desire for adventure and excitement, with a social calendar that was always full of interesting activities. Meanwhile, I focused on rebuilding my life after the divorce. I threw myself into my career, developed closer friendships, and eventually started dating again. About 2 years ago, I met my current boyfriend James, who's kind, stable, and genuinely interested in building a meaningful relationship with me. James and I have been talking about moving in together and potentially getting engaged next year. He's nothing like Marcus. He values consistency and commitment, and he's never made me feel like I need to be someone different to keep his interest. I thought I'd moved completely past my relationship with Marcus and rarely thought about him or his marriage to Stephanie. When I did see updates about them on social media, I felt nothing more than mild curiosity about how they were doing. But last month, I started hearing rumors through mutual friends that Marcus and Stephanie's marriage was having problems. According to people who knew them, they'd been fighting frequently, and Stephanie had been spending a lot of time with Marcus's family, particularly his younger brother Tyler. Tyler is 32M and has always been the more outgoing and charismatic of the two brothers. During my marriage to Marcus, Tyler was single and had a reputation for being charming and adventurous. He traveled constantly for his job in sales and always had interesting stories about places he'd been and people he'd met. Marcus had always been somewhat jealous of Tyler's lifestyle and personality. He'd make comments about how Tyler was naturally more social and confident, and how people were drawn to Tyler in ways they weren't drawn to Marcus. 3 weeks ago, I heard through a mutual friend that Stephanie had left Marcus and moved in with Tyler. Apparently, Stephanie and Tyler had been having an affair for several months, and when Marcus discovered their relationship, Stephanie chose Tyler over her marriage. According to friends, Marcus was completely devastated by Stephanie's betrayal. Not only had she cheated on him, but she'd done it with his own brother, which destroyed his relationship with Tyler and caused major drama in his family. I felt bad for Marcus when I heard this news, despite everything that had happened between us. Being betrayed by your spouse and your siblings simultaneously seemed like an especially cruel situation, and I couldn't imagine how painful that must have been. But I certainly wasn't expecting Marcus to show up at my apartment last night. I was getting ready for bed around 11 p.m. when I heard someone knocking on my door. When I looked through the peephole, I saw Marcus standing in a hallway holding flowers and looking disheveled. I hadn't seen Marcus in person for over 3 years, and he looked terrible. His hair was messy, his clothes were wrinkled, and his eyes were red like he'd been crying. When I opened the door, Marcus immediately started apologizing and saying he knew he had no right to be there. He said he'd been driving around for hours trying to work up the courage to talk to me. Marcus told me that Stephanie had left him for Tyler, and that his whole life had fallen apart. He said losing Stephanie had made him realize that I was the best thing that had ever happened to him, and that he'd made a huge mistake when he chose her over our marriage. He said that Stephanie's betrayal had shown him what real loyalty and commitment looked like, and that he now understood how valuable our relationship had been. Marcus claimed that he'd been immature and selfish when he left me, and that he'd spent the past few weeks thinking about all the ways I'd been a better partner than he deserved. Marcus begged me to consider giving our relationship another chance. He said he was a different person now, and that losing everything had taught him to appreciate stability and genuine love rather than chasing excitement and novelty. He promised that if I'd take him back, he'd spend the rest of his life making up for the pain he'd caused me. Marcus said he realized now that I was his soulmate and that he'd been an idiot to throw away our marriage for someone who didn't truly love him. I listened to Marcus's speech without saying much, trying to process the surreal situation of my ex-husband begging for reconciliation on my doorstep 5 years after our divorce. When Marcus finished talking, I told him that I was sorry he was going through such a difficult time, but that I'd moved on with my life and wasn't interested in rekindling our relationship. Marcus started crying harder and said he understood why I'd be hesitant, but that he hoped I could find it in my heart to forgive him. He said he knew he didn't deserve another chance, but that he'd do anything to prove he'd changed. I told Marcus that this wasn't about forgiveness. I'd already forgiven him years ago as part of my own healing process. But I explained that I was in a happy relationship now and that I had no desire to go backwards in my life. Marcus seemed shocked to learn that I was dating someone else. He said he'd assumed I was still single and that maybe we were meant to find our way back to each other eventually. I told Marcus that his assumption said a lot about how little he'd thought about my life and well-being since our divorce. I pointed out that he'd only come to me after his marriage fell apart, not because he'd been missing me or thinking about our relationship during the past 5 years. Marcus tried to argue that he had been thinking about me, but that he'd respected my space and hadn't wanted to interfere with my healing process. He claimed he'd always hoped we might reconcile someday but hadn't acted on those feelings because he thought I needed time. I told Marcus that his timing revealed his true motivations. He wasn't there because he'd realized he loved me. He was there because he was alone and hurt and looking for someone to comfort him. Marcus got more upset and insisted that losing Stephanie had genuinely made him realize what he'd lost when he divorced me. He said that experiencing betrayal had given him perspective on how badly he treated me and how much I'd meant to him. I told Marcus that I was glad he'd gained some perspective, but that his personal growth didn't create any obligation for me to reconsider our relationship. I said I hoped he'd learn from this experience and would treat future partners better. When it became clear that I wasn't going to change my mind, Marcus asked if we could at least stay in touch and maybe work toward rebuilding a friendship. He said he missed having me in his life and that he'd like to find a way to repair the damage he'd caused. I told Marcus that I didn't think staying in contact would be healthy for either of us. I said he needed to focus on healing from his recent losses and figuring out what he wanted for his future, without using me as an emotional crutch. Marcus left the flowers on my doorstep and walked away looking defeated. I watched him get into his car and drive away, feeling a mixture of sadness for his situation and relief that I'd stood firm in my boundaries. After Marcus left, I called James to tell him what had happened. James was supportive and understanding and said he was proud of me for handling the situation clearly and kindly. Update: 2 weeks later. Marcus has been trying to contact me through various methods since our conversation. He sent flowers to my workplace, left voicemails on my phone, and even reached out to some of my friends asking them to put in a good word for him. I've been ignoring all of his attempts at communication, but his persistence is starting to make me uncomfortable. Yesterday, he showed up at the coffee shop where I usually go on Saturday mornings, clearly hoping to run into me. When Marcus saw me, he approached my table and asked if we could talk. I told him that I'd already said everything I needed to say and that his continued attempts to contact me were inappropriate. Marcus apologized for bothering me but said he couldn't stop thinking about our conversation and hoping I might reconsider. He said he'd been going to therapy and working on himself and that he wanted me to see how much he'd changed. I told Marcus that I was happy he was getting help, but that his personal growth didn't change my decision about our relationship. I said that if he really cared about my well-being, he'd respect my request for no contact. Marcus seemed to finally understand that I was serious about not wanting to reconcile. He apologized for bothering me and said he'd stop trying to reach out. I haven't heard from Marcus since that conversation, and I'm hoping he'll keep his word about leaving me alone. I've also heard through mutual friends that Marcus's family situation has gotten even more complicated. Apparently, Tyler and Stephanie broke up after just a few weeks together, and now the whole family is dealing with the aftermath of their affair. Marcus's parents are reportedly furious with Tyler for betraying his brother, and Tyler has been basically cut off from the family. Stephanie has moved back to her hometown and isn't in contact with any of them anymore. It sounds like Marcus lost his wife, his brother, and his family's stability all in the span of a few months. I feel bad for him, but I'm also grateful that I'm not part of that drama anymore. Update: 1 month later. Marcus sent me a long email apologizing for his behavior over the past few weeks and saying he finally understood why I didn't want him in my life. He said he'd been selfish and desperate, and that he realized he'd been trying to use me to avoid dealing with his own problems. In the email, Marcus said he was moving to a different city to start over, and that he wouldn't bother me anymore. He thanked me for the years we'd spent together, and said he hoped I'd be happy with James. I didn't respond to the email, but I was relieved to hear that Marcus was planning to move away and focus on his own healing process. James and I have been talking more seriously about our future together, and this whole situation with Marcus has actually made me more confident about our relationship. Seeing the contrast between Marcus's instability and James's steady support has reminded me how much I value consistency and genuine commitment. We're planning to move in together next month, and James has hinted that he's thinking about proposing soon. I'm excited about our future and grateful that I didn't let Marcus's crisis derail the good life I've built for myself. Update: for months later. I haven't heard anything from Marcus since he sent that final email, and according to mutual friends, he did follow through on moving to another city. Apparently, he found a job in Portland and has been trying to rebuild his life there. James and I moved in together 3 months ago, and it's been wonderful. We're planning a vacation together this summer and have been looking at engagement rings. I feel more secure and happy in this relationship than I ever did during my marriage to Marcus. I occasionally think about Marcus and hope he's doing better, but I don't regret my decision to maintain boundaries with him. His crisis wasn't my responsibility to fix, and getting back together with him would have been a huge step backwards for both of us. Sometimes I wonder if Marcus really learned anything from losing Stephanie and Tyler, or if he'll just repeat the same patterns in his next relationship. But that's not my problem to worry about anymore. Update: 10 months later. James proposed to me last month, and I said yes. We're planning a small wedding for next spring, with just close family and friends. I'm happier than I've been in years and feel grateful every day for the stable, loving relationship we've built together. I heard through a mutual friend that Marcus is dating someone new in Portland and seems to be doing better. I'm glad he's moving forward with his life, and I hope he's learned to appreciate what he has instead of always looking for something more exciting. Stephanie and Tyler apparently got back together briefly a few months ago, but broke up again after more drama. From what I understand, Stephanie has a pattern of jumping between relationships when things get difficult, which explains a lot about what happened with Marcus. Looking back on everything, I'm grateful that Marcus's crisis forced me to really examine how much I'd grown and changed since our divorce. His desperation and instability made me appreciate the peace and security I have with James even more. I don't think Marcus was lying when he said he'd realized what he'd lost. I think losing Stephanie really did give him some perspective on our marriage. But understanding what you lost and being capable of appreciating it are two different things. Marcus always wanted what he couldn't have and got bored with what he had, and I don't think one painful experience changed that fundamental part of his personality. I'm just glad I was strong enough to stick to my boundaries and not get pulled back into his chaos. Sometimes the best thing you can do for someone is refuse to be their safety net when they've made bad choices.